On this Sunday night, salvaging the ceasefires. Israel is accused of firing on civilians in Lebanon and preventing Palestinians from returning home in Gaza, threatening the fragile truce on both fronts. Pandemic report.
It's a disappointing document.
An Alberta task force sparks controversy after calling for an end to COVID-19 vaccines. We'll speak with a family physician about what's fueling vaccine hesitancy. Plus, pining for Panama.
We're taking it back.
The history behind Donald Trump's demand for control of this crucial canal.
Global National. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. We begin with breaking news from the Middle East. Israel says an agreement has just been reached that will allow Palestinians to return to northern Gaza on Monday. Hamas will release 6 more Israeli hostages this week, including a civilian who was supposed to be freed on Saturday. This latest agreement resolves an impasse that threatened the fragile truce between Israel and Hamas. But as Caryn Lieberman reports, it's not the only ceasefire in danger of collapsing.
Tens of thousands of displaced Palestinians on foot and in vehicles, desperate to return home to northern Gaza, wait at Israeli military roadblocks, unable to cross. As part of the ceasefire agreement, Israel should have withdrawn its forces, but refused, accusing Hamas of breaching its end of the deal over civilian hostage Arbel Yehud.
For us, it's one long day since October the 7th. And in this one long day, what keep us is the big hope and faith that they will come back to us healthy.
On Saturday, 4 Israeli female soldiers were released in return for 200 Palestinian prisoners. But an Israeli military spokesperson said Yehud, abducted from Kibbutz Nir Oz during the October 7th attack, was scheduled to be freed first. They called her absence a breach of the truce. By late Sunday, Israel's prime minister announced Hamas will release 6 hostages this week, and in turn, Israel will allow Gazans to return home. Tensions are also high in the West Bank. There was a funeral for a 2-year-old girl who the Palestinian Health Ministry says was killed Sunday during an Israeli raid. They started shooting at us through the windows, said the child's grandmother. Israel is conducting a major operation in the area, which the military says is aimed at countering Iranian-backed militant groups. The Israeli military said it is investigating the incident. And to the north, Israel's ceasefire in Lebanon is also proving fragile, with forces refusing to withdraw by a Sunday deadline, blaming the Lebanese army for failing to uphold its end of the agreement by not securing the region. They say Israeli forces have killed 22 people. The White House saying late in the day that the agreement between Lebanon and Israel will be extended until February 18th. Caryn Lieberman, Global News, Toronto.
And more breaking news from Afghanistan, where a Canadian military veteran detained by the Taliban has now been released. On social media, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly says David Lavery has safely arrived in Qatar and is in good spirits. There are no other details about his release, but Joly also thanked her Qatari counterpart for helping. Lavery, a former soldier, had been working in Afghanistan, helping Afghans, including former military interpreters, to escape. He was detained by the Taliban in November. Israel's prime minister is scheduled to travel to Poland, where he'll be joined by other world leaders, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, to commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the notorious Auschwitz concentration camp, where more than 1 million people were killed by the Nazis during the Second World War. Our Mackenzie Gray is traveling with the Canadian Prime Minister. Mackenzie.
It's set to be one of Justin Trudeau's final trips as Prime Minister. He's come to Krakow, Poland for events around the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Mr. Trudeau will be joined by Deborah Lyons, his anti-Semitism advisor, as well as Canadian Holocaust survivors, and he'll be one of many world leaders attending this event. Emmanuel Macron from France, Olaf Scholz from Germany also in attendance. But there has been some controversy here in Poland about a stance the Polish government has taken, saying that they will not follow through on any arrest warrants against Israeli officials. That's, of course, in relation to the International Criminal Court and allegations of war crimes associated with folks, including Benjamin Netanyahu. He said he won't be coming. No word on who could potentially be attending the ceremonies from Israel. Once Mr. Trudeau's done in Krakow, he'll head to Warsaw to meet with both the President and the Prime Minister of Poland. One key thing likely to be discussed, Ukraine, shared values between Canada and Poland on Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of refugees taken in from both countries, billions of dollars to be spent from both countries as well, too. And focusing on issues like Ukraine is something that Mr. Trudeau will likely do in his final days as Prime Minister, focusing on legacy issues with less than 50 days left in his Prime Ministership. Mackenzie Gray, Global News, Krakow, Poland.
An update on the race to replace Justin Trudeau. The Federal Liberal Party has ruled that MP Chandra Arya is ineligible to run. In a social media post, Arya responded saying that he is carefully considering his next steps, and the decision raises significant questions about the legitimacy of the leadership race and, by extension, the legitimacy of the next Prime Minister of Canada. The Liberal Party did not explain its decision, but says candidates can be removed if they don't meet mandatory criteria, are unfit, or due to their past conduct. Arya made headlines early in the race for admitting that he does not speak French.
Marc, je te passe la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Merci pour ton soutien, François-Philippe.
The perceived frontrunner in that race, Mark Carney, picked up another key endorsement today in Quebec. Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne pledged his support, one of 17 cabinet ministers who now back Carney, by far the most of any candidate. The opposition leader is taking aim. Pierre Poilievre posting this letter this morning addressed to Carney, asking if he would ban Justin Trudeau's cabinet members from continuing in their roles.
I think he's scared is the first thing. Why is he writing me a letter on a Sunday morning, first off?
Carney is among 6 Liberal candidates. The new leader will be chosen on March 9th. An adult and 2 children have died in an apartment fire in Hamilton, Ontario. Emergency crews were called to this high-rise building near the city's waterfront at around 10 this morning. Firefighters say they were met with heavy flames and smoke from a first-floor unit. 8 people were taken to hospital. The Ontario Fire Marshal's office is now investigating the cause. A report in Alberta is calling on that province to halt the use of COVID-19 vaccines. That review was commissioned by Premier Danielle Smith's government in the fall of 2022, and it was quietly published on Friday. But as Heather Yourex-West reports, critics have been quick to push back.
In a $2 million government-commissioned report, a task force panel led by former Alberta emergency medicine physician Dr. Gary Davidson is criticizing the province's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, saying authorities were too restrictive when it came to drug therapies like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and too quick to approve the COVID-19 vaccine.
There's a lot of self-citing that goes on. So many of the studies that the report cites were written by members of the task force. There's no contrary view.
Danielle Smith, the vocal critic of the government's pandemic response, won the leadership of the UCP in 2022 with promises to protect against future lockdowns or vaccine mandates. Her government amended the Provincial Bill of Rights to allow people to opt out of vaccines last fall. But the Davidson report calls for more, recommending use of the COVID vaccine be stopped completely until more research can be done.
This is a sad document. It's a disappointing document. It's a document that to my mind lacks significant credibility.
I didn't really see evidence of literature search or methods where they evaluated the quality of literature prior to including it in the report. And kind of with that, I perceived that a lot of better quality information was omitted from the report in some of the sections.
Health Canada continues to recommend the COVID vaccine. Speaking on an Alberta podcast Friday, Dr. Davidson defended the panel's research methods.
There's no such thing as consensus in science. That makes no sense. Science is about questioning everything, experimenting and proving whether it's true or not. That's science.
In a statement, Alberta's health ministry says the panel was made up of health professionals from diverse practice areas in order to help the province better protect Albertans in the future. Now, the government is currently reviewing the findings of this report, but no policy decisions have been made in response, at least not yet. Jeff?
Heather Yourex-West in Calgary. Thanks, Heather. Since the pandemic, vaccination rates for other preventable diseases have been dropping in Canada, fueled in part by online misinformation and a growing distrust in the scientific community. Earlier today, I spoke with one Ontario doctor on the front lines of that fight. And joining me now is Dr. Joy Hatley. She's a family physician in Kingston, Ontario. Dr. Hatley, thanks so much for joining us. So what do you make of these numbers suggesting that vaccination rates are dropping?
Well, we're at an inflection point, quite honestly, and I'm often very discouraged by what I hear both in private conversations and in the public realm, because I think we're moving away from fact, away from what we know to be true. We are having a lot of consternation about vaccination in this day and age. And, it started with the concerns around COVID-19 vaccine, but it's now extending to areas of vaccination that we have previously and appropriately accepted to protect our health and well-being. So now people aren't necessarily vaccinating themselves to mumps, measles, diseases that we haven't seen in North America for a long time. We're now seeing outbreaks because people are dropping vaccinations. And this is very, very concerning.
All right. And what needs to happen to turn that trend around, to restore that trust?
I think it's honest conversations. We still know that by and large, we trust physicians in our society. So sometimes the only way to respond to this public discourse that is so confusing for people is in one-on-one conversations with the person that you trust to guide your healthcare. And I think the access to family physicians is now part of that. Now, fully 37% of Canadians don't actually have access to that relationship. So, what I'm recommending to combat some of this is actually not accessible to people en masse in Canada anymore. There's a growing number of people who don't have access to that resource to take medical advance in fact and apply it to their own personal situation, because they need a translator to do so. They need a physician to do so, and they don't have that access. So that's something we need to really seriously look at as a society and say, how do we fix this? Or do we understand the true value of it and what we're giving up by not protecting that resource for each individual Canadian?
Dr. Joy Hatley, thanks so much for joining us.
All right, till next time.
Trump tariffs and Canadian cars. Coming up, what the U.S. president's plans could mean for the Canadian auto sector. U.S. President Donald Trump is vowing to impose heavy sanctions and tariffs on Colombia for turning away 2 U.S. flights carrying migrants. Trump posted the denial of these flights has jeopardized the national security and public safety of the United States, and he has ordered his administration to take decisive retaliatory measures. It's the second case of a Latin American nation refusing U.S. military deportation flights after Mexico last week. Colombia's president condemned the move, saying migrants are not criminals and should be treated with dignity. Trump is also threatening to put tariffs on all Canadian imports as soon as February the 1st. Canada's automotive sector is especially nervous. It employs around 120,000 people and exports tens of billions of dollars in vehicles and parts to the U.S. every year. Mike Armstrong explains why Trump's tariffs could stall Canada's auto sector.
Close to 10% of vehicles on the road in the U.S. were made in Canada, but they're not at all completely Canadian products. The industry is so integrated between this country and our neighbors to the south that before a vehicle is assembled, the parts are estimated to have crossed the border up to 8 times. And it's not new. This plant in Windsor, Ontario has been making cars since 1928.
The trade that we have between Canada and the United States is fair trade. It's fair, free trade. We aren't the source of the angst.
I'd rather have it done in Detroit.
Well, Donald Trump says he wants the automobile industry moved back to the U.S. from Canada and Mexico. He's promised tariffs starting February 1st.
if he does that in automotive.
Flavio Volpe is with Canada's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. His members, he says, work on slim margins. For many, a 5% tariff would wipe out profits. 10% would start putting companies out of business. 25% would mean there's no reason to keep going.
Every product that any of these companies would build would be booking a loss right away.
The first impact of tariffs would be inflation. The cost of vehicles would jump, but it would also cost jobs in both countries. Canadian parts suppliers own more than 150 plants in 19 U.S. states, employing 50,000 Americans. If Trump tries to push tariffs through by declaring an economic or national security emergency, Volpe says there would be court challenges.
It's pretty easy to argue that a Canadian crew cab pickup truck isn't a threat to their national security.
Now, the way the industry is built with cooperation across the border is supposed to make North America more competitive, to help it compete with countries with long histories making vehicles and one big up-and-comer.
We're all worried about China, and this is like going into a race against a top sprinter but breaking your own foot on purpose.
Even if tariffs did force jobs back to the U.S., a trade war would hurt companies in that country. Almost 40% of the vehicles and parts produced by the U.S. are bought by Canada. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
Crisis in the Congo still ahead. UN peacekeepers are killed as rebels close in on Goma. The Democratic Republic of Congo is spiraling into chaos. More than a dozen UN peacekeepers have been killed in a dangerous escalation of a violent conflict driven by a group of Rwandan-backed rebels called M23. Those rebels are now encroaching on a provincial capital, and as Julia Foy reports, it's deepening an already deadly humanitarian crisis.
Hundreds of displaced people with children in arms are trying to find safe haven in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Anthony says, I am very hungry. I left Minova yesterday for Nzulo, but the situation is not good either. So I'm now heading somewhere, but I don't know where. A group of rebels with alleged backing from Rwanda called M23 has been escalating violence by taking over several small towns since 2022. But in January, the bloody conflict intensified. Rebels began targeting UN peacekeepers, killing at least 13 to date. Rwanda denies any involvement.
I send here a clear and unequivocal message to the M23 and its backers that actions endangering the lives of civilians and UN peacekeepers will not be tolerated.
As the hospital in the capital of Goma has been overwhelmed with the number of casualties seeking medical help, Canada is speaking out as well. From the Honourable Melanie Joly, Minister of Foreign Affairs, we deplore the devastating consequences of the violations of the ceasefire, displacing nearly 400,000 civilians and worsening already difficult humanitarian conditions. Congolese officials have condemned Rwanda's involvement in the ongoing conflict, but rebels have already reached the outskirts of the capital city.
Roads are blocked and the airport can no longer be used for evacuation or humanitarian efforts.
As for civilians, they are hanging on to the promise of peace. Julia Foy, Global News, Vancouver.
Panama under pressure. Up next, what's behind Trump's threat to retake the Panama Canal? Welcome back. The new U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio's first foreign trip this week will take him to Panama, a country that, like Canada and Greenland, has found itself in the crosshairs of Donald Trump. The U.S. president has threatened to take over the Panama Canal. As Eric Sorensen explains, the U.S. has a long and complicated connection to the vital trade route.
The Panama Canal is indispensable to global trade and to Panama, generating a quarter of the country's annual income from the 15,000 ships that pass through each year. So when Donald Trump said this,
we gave it to Panama and we're taking it back.
Panamanians understandably freaked out a little. Neither Trump or the U.S. Army or government have anything to do with Panama, says this union leader. What's in Panama belongs to Panamanians. That's not how some Americans see it.
What you're finding with President Trump is a long-held belief that the Panama Canal should have never been tendered to Panama.
It's complicated. More than 100 years ago, U.S. businesses wanted a canal to save time and money on shipping between the Atlantic and Pacific. At the same time, Panamanian separatists in the narrow isthmus wanted independence from what was then Colombia. U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt's gunboat diplomacy helped create the country and then signed a treaty to create the canal. The Panama Canal was a remarkable feat of U.S. engineering, building locks that raise boats more than 25 meters up to a man-made freshwater lake. The ships sail across, the fresh water feeds the canal, and the locks lower the ships back to sea level on the other side of Panama. A 10-hour trip that used to take weeks around South America. The Americans also created the U.S.-controlled Panama Canal Zone, 80 kilometers along the entire route and 8 kilometers on either side of the canal that Panamanians had no access to. Panamanians resented it. Protests and riots led to a new treaty signed in 1977 to turn the canal over to Panama in 1999. But the treaty also permits U.S. intervention to maintain security, and President Trump sees a security threat.
Look, the Panama Canal is vital to our country. It's being operated by China. China.
That is not true. Only Panamanians operate the canal by law.
Some Panamanians worry that the U.S. military will invade, as it did 35 years ago to depose dictator Manuel Noriega. Panama's president was asked this week about an invasion.
Be serious, be serious.
Jose Raul Mulino dismissed the threats. In recent years, Panama has spent billions on its own to expand the waterway. But the U.S. has a long history with the canal, and it's not clear what exactly Donald Trump has in mind when he says he wants to take it back. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National. For this Sunday night, I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada is Portugal Cove, St. Phillips, Newfoundland, and Labrador. We love seeing your Canada, so please keep emailing your photos to globalnational@globalnews.ca. Thanks for watching. Donna will be back with you tomorrow. Have a great night.